The following audio recording has been designed for learning purposes only. Do not share, distribute, or provide any type of copies, or this audio lesson will not be made available to you. Good luck with today's lesson.
Has everybody worked on, I didn't check the last couple days, but have you been doing your vocabulary? Is everybody pretty much done with that? Okay. Since your test is on Thursday, it'll probably close sometimes Thursday night or Friday morning. But if you haven't done it, just make sure you do it. Okay. The vocabulary quiz, the one that I told you to talk to me about later. Yeah. The test itself is going to be on Thursday, and you're not doing that online. You're doing it here in class. Yeah. So I just sent it to be published last night. So. Okay. I've got just so this is how it's going to work out today. I've got I think I just had like one or two slides left from chapter 16, and then I have a short talk I'm going to do on industrial America relating to mining here in Michigan. And then we're going to review for the test, and we'll see where that leads us. I told you the other day you might have time to go to the library. It'll probably be the only time all semester that I'll let you have time to go and work during class time on your research, your family genealogy project. So we can go over there, and you can see what you can find. But that's the only time I think all semester that I'll probably have to let you work on that in class. We'll see. You never know. It could work out maybe in October at one point. But anyway, so I'm just gonna. I don't know if I showed you one last slide from 16, and then. As far as the test goes, while I'm setting the rest of this up, make sure you have a Scantron on Thursday. It needs to be 50 questions on the front side, 1 to 50. It can be the red or the green one. Either one works. So that's there'll be, if I'm remembering correctly, because I was changing things last night, there were 38 multiple choice, and then there's 12 short answers. And there were some extra credit. I think there were five extra credits. So everything's worth 2 points except for the extra credit, which is worth 1 point. So if you take my online classes, you don't get any extra credit because if you're taking it online, I'm not there to watch see what you're doing. So you get a lot less time on the online class to do it. Thursday, if you need 20 minutes to take the test, that's great. If you need 40 minutes, if you need an hour and 40 minutes, I'm just here. You can take the test. So generally it takes people anywhere from probably 30 minutes to an hour. Yeah. But if you need more time, I'm not going to really rush you if you until obviously we have to go and the next class will be coming in. Are there any questions that you might have about any vocabulary? Oh, good. If there's something that you think of, make sure you just send me an email or message me.
Is the review sheet part of the vocab that we need to know?
The review sheet is the vocabulary, yeah. And that's all the terms. So
I'm talking about the one that mostly have people's names.
Oh, the very first
Yes.
one. Yeah, so the very first one from that first day of class, they'll make sure you know abolitionist because that's going to show up. And yeah, so there were a few. I've changed things around so this semester is a little at this point, for our purposes this semester, make sure, I think the only one that showed up for the review this time was abolitionists, because I mostly I focused on 14, 15, and 16 from the printouts that I gave you, and then there were a few extra terms actually on the vocabulary quiz on Canvas. Yeah, there were a few little extra terms that didn't show up on for. I guess I didn't realize when I was building it online that I had a few less on the sheets here. But so they should pretty much coordinate, but just make sure that you pay special attention to the ones on Canvas, because there are like maybe 4 or 5 more terms on the Canvas sheets than on the printed one.
So is like the test like the quizzes, like is that how?
So the quizzes are just there to make sure that you know what the terms are going to be that I'm going to be asking you on the test. Yeah. They're really more of a just kind of forcing you to at least look at them, because sometimes people don't look at them at all, and that's not good. It's like, yeah, if you know the terms, there's no reason why you won't get an A on the test.
Now, the vocabulary.
I know there's a lot of terms.
The vocabulary quizzes are
Yeah.
the ones that are going to close.
Yeah, the vocabulary quiz in Canvas will close at either Thursday night or Friday morning.
For 14, 15, and 16.
Right.
But the rest is still real.
The rest is still. So I don't know that this class saw this last slide. Because I think you saw this one and then we had to go, but this was actually the last slide, which I didn't get to. So you know, I was talking about all the inequality that's going on in this period between the end of the Civil War and basically the start of World War I, around that period, late 19 teens, up to 1920. Because this is the period when you have mass immigration. It's this period of great industrialization as well in the United States, massive amounts of money, the consumeristic society in which we live is being created, and so much of that wealth is being created because you have access to so many natural resources with the opening of the West, cheap transportation system of the railroads, and of course the immigrant labor and the farm labor as well. We shouldn't ignore that, but these big farm families, there's not the opportunity certainly for all those children as well. There is opportunity because you do have the Homestead Act, right? But you also have the lure of the city. And so many young people don't want to have the life of their parents. They want to try something new, and they move into the city, which is fine if they have an education. But if you don't, whether you're born here or born somewhere else, then you end up doing this menial labor in which you're working in a factory, and those are the lowest paying jobs, really without hope for advancement. Okay, so keep all that in mind. So, and then of course the great disparity. Although certainly the disparity from that period, and then the disparity of the 1920s as well, and actually the time that we live in is all very similar. That you have these periods in history where you have most of society sharing about having the same amount as wealth as the top 1 or 2%. So that was going on then. It was also going on, there's similarities to the 1920s when the stock market was booming. And then actually the time we live in, it's very, very similar. A lot of historians talk about how we're living in the second Gilded Age right now. So the next part, what I'm going to do, this actually, because this is a slideshow, and this actually isn't in Canvas. So, but it's one of the few things that isn't there yet, at least this semester. But I wanted you still to be aware of it. Um, so this is the Ontonagon boulder, which is the massive piece of float copper. It sat in the Ontonagon River in Michigan's northwestern upper peninsula for thousands and thousands of years, since it was deposited there by the glaciers. And it was ripped out of the earth during the time of the glaciers, and then when they melted, dropped. And what's important about copper in Michigan is that it's pure. It's 99% pure. The only impurity is any type of minerals that are actually attached to it that have to be smelted, basically melted off, and then it can be used for whatever purposes might be needed for making copper wire. Of course, so important during the Industrial Revolution, and discovery of a vast amount of copper in the United States was extremely important because until the 1840s, the copper that was being used in this country was being imported from Europe, and therefore that was expensive. So it's just one of many, many examples, of course, is this great resource that helps the United States industry and economy, of course, to prosper throughout the 19th century. And the first mineral rush, I think you heard me say at one point, that the first mineral rush in the United States was actually here in Michigan, up in the Upper Peninsula, back in the mid-1840s. So before the gold rush in California, which most people know about that, and even people who live in Michigan generally don't know that you had this mineral rush that was so important. And many of the miners, the prospectors who were up in the Keweenaw Peninsula were later in California a few years later. So here's Douglas Houghton, Michigan's first geologist. He's actually the guy who really made the discovery of the copper in Michigan's Upper Peninsula. And in case you're not familiar with the area of the state, it's that far northwestern portion of the state. This is the Keweenaw Peninsula that juts out into Lake Superior, and it's up here at Copper Harbor that where the boats would dock and the prospectors would go out into the woods to try to make their fortune in copper. Didn't work out good for them because you needed massive backing of money to actually make money in copper. So you had to have big corporations. Yeah.
So the two copper mines that in his question for me is Copper Harbor.
So the two copper mines that I'll tell you about in a moment.
Oh.
Yeah. So this is just where the copper, most of the copper is. There's still copper there today, but the problem is it's so deep in the Earth's surface that it's not economically viable to actually extract it anymore. Some of them, one of the mines, the Quincy mine, it was over a mile deep at the turn of the 20th century, so over 100 years ago, that they were already down that far into the surface of the Earth. And so it just became too expensive to extract copper. So what's interesting about the western part of Michigan is that until the early 1840s, the United States actually didn't own the western about third or two-thirds of the Upper Peninsula. It was still owned by the native Indians, the Chippewa tribes up there. And it's only after the Treaty of La Pointe, this is actually just a copy of the Treaty of La Pointe from 1842, it goes into effect in early 1843, that legally the United States actually owned that land. And it could be open, because legally no white person was supposed to go into the western part of the UP until after the treaty was officially went into effect. So that's Copper Harbor. Most people who live in the States never even been there because it's so far away. You can drive to Washington, D.C. In about the same amount of time as driving to Copper Harbor. So the first mines were actually extracting what was these veins of copper, massive, huge veins of copper, pure copper, that had been pushed up into the Earth's surface at some point in the geologic history, because that portion of the Upper Peninsula is some of the oldest bedrock to be found still at the surface of the Earth. And at some point, they were volcanoes. And then at a later point, molten copper was pushed up into the vents of the volcanoes. And so this is called a cliff mine, which was the first successful mine in the Upper Peninsula. It wasn't the largest mine, it wasn't the most important mine. It's important historically because it made a profit. But it would be later mines that would have to go deep into the earth, extracting small bits of copper that would end up being very successful. This mine was only successful for around 20 years. A bit less than that, actually. By the time of the Civil War, it's pretty much mined out. So they're mining starting in the 1840s, early 50s. So really, it's only a bit over a decade, actually, that the Cliff Mine was successful. And that kind of copper is called fissure copper if it's found in these massive quantities in which they can just extract like huge veins of it where they actually have to blast it out or in some cases hacksaw it out. And most of the copper found in Michigan is actually just in tiny little bits like the size of your fingernail or smaller. And they can come in two different types called conglomerate or amygdaloid, and which is found in the rock itself. These small little bits, and they'd have to crush it and then smelt it off. And this is what some of the rock looks like. And the conglomerate rock looks like this, where it's just little tiny flecks and bits, but most of it is actually just useless rock. And initially, when they're doing this in the 1860s and 70s, they actually have guys with the steam hammers taking rocks, making big rocks into little rocks. Eventually, there's inventions that will end up making the process much easier. But that fissure copper is solid chunks of copper, so huge chunks that can be cut out or blasted out of the surface of the earth. And then the Ontonagon boulder, it was essentially what that was a piece of fissure copper that when the glaciers came by, it ripped off the top of these extinct volcanoes and ripped out a lot of that fissure copper. And when it's just already just lying around the forest, it's called float copper because it had been floating in the ice thousands of years ago. So you probably learned about glaciers at some point in your education. You know, they can be 1 mile to 2 miles thick, and so they put enormous pressure and force on the earth wherever they are, and so they can really mess the surface of the earth up. You know, we're still feeling the effects of it today. Every year the earth rebounds just a tiny little bit. So here's a picture of miners in the early days when they started to have to go deeper and deeper into the earth. It's a great picture because it always reminds me of playing Mario Brothers because this is called a man bob, and it's like an early form of kind of an elevator. And it's 2 different platforms that are being powered by a steam engine, and they bob up and down like this. And instead of having to go down these long ladders, which you could, this was an easier way to get down to work or up to work. You would jump back and forth from these platforms. It could not be very safe if you got your foot caught in between the two. Although it looks like it might have been enough space, hopefully, between platforms. So that only could be used for a short period. It was only used for a short period because then they would end up building essentially like a form of elevator. They would build these man cars where the men would sit in them, and they would be on a long cable that would go down into the earth on an angle. Yeah. The guys automated tram cars. The tram cars, which held out the copper and the rock, had to be pushed by men. And they were called trammers. And so here you see two trammers. I have a book a friend of mine gave me on copper mining in the 19th century. And one of the stories in it is taken from a diary of a trammer who had come from somewhere in Eastern Europe in the 19th century. And his first job was to do this job as a trammer. And he talked about, he would wear these big boots, and he would have to stop periodically to pour out all the sweat that would collect in his boots. That's how hard the work was.
I like their lights.
So I think I heard my great-grandpa did that for a while, because he was a miner up there in one of the copper mines. Oh yeah, those lights. The lights were run by kerosene. Yeah, you can see that's a big. See, there's a big flash there.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's actually their lights. So there's a little receptacle in which you would have the kerosene in there, and then you would light it, and that's how you would be able to see in those dark mines in the days before electricity. You can take tours of some of those mine shafts nowadays because it's a national park up there. It's called the Keweenaw National Historical Park, and some of the sites are open to the public. And so it's pretty fascinating to go in there, but they're, of course, lit by electricity nowadays. So Callium and Hecla was one of the most successful mines, one of the largest mines up there. So an extremely important mine that for decades paid good dividends. It was really good investment.
Those are the names of the
So Callium and Hecla, that's one mining company. Yeah, that's an important one. And then it was run by this gentleman, Alexander Agassiz, who actually did it because it paid well, but he actually had other interests, but he ended up running the company for decades because he was able to spend part of his year doing other things. This is actually a photograph of some of the mines, one of the mines right directly in Calumet, and some of the various buildings. The city of, or the town of Calumet in those days was actually called Red Jacket. Much of the money that financed the exploration and the mining itself came from the city of Boston, of course, one of the oldest cities and historic cities in the country, but of course being one of the earliest settlements of the United States. There was a great amount of wealth that was created there over the centuries, and so in the early 20th century there were many interested, wealthy men who wanted to invest in the copper mining in the 19th century. So that's what they did. And so Payne Weber, this is an abandoned building actually in Calumet, but that's a remnant of all that money that had been flowing into Calumet, and then all the money that was flowing out, because millions and millions of dollars were made. I was at a house in Boston several years ago. I was helping someone, and I met a guy who owned this huge mansion, and we were helping return some things from a museum exhibition that he had loaned. And he was telling me how many people in Boston from these old families are living off the millions that they made in copper mining, investing in copper mining from the 19th century. So, including his family. The reason why it came up, because he had a solid copper ashtray in the house that I noticed. And I mentioned something, and he said, "Oh, my ancestors in the 19th century invested in copper mines," and that was kind of a souvenir or something. I said, "Oh, my ancestors worked in the copper mines." So, if you ever go to the Henry Ford Museum in Greenfield Village, one of the trains from the locomotive from Calumet Hecla Mining Company that used to haul the copper ore down to the smelting operations is actually used there. It was bought by Mr. Ford decades ago, and this locomotive was just restored in the last few years. So they've used it for many years, but it had to be completely rebuilt. And so that's only recently happened where it's been completely rebuilt. And so
They still
see that.
using it, or is it?
They still use it, yeah. Yeah. My grandma, this actually went by my great-grandparents' farm when my grandma was a little kid, this locomotive. The Quincy Mining Company is actually the other major mining company from Michigan's copper mining days. And it's open to the public today. It's part of the national park system. It's an interesting arrangement that the federal government has with this national park. It was an experiment back in the 1990s because the federal government was trying to save money when they created this park. And so they did something that they never did before, is that they only have purchased a few sites. Generally when the federal government has a national park, they purchase everything that's significant. In this case, what they've done is they've purchased gradually some important sites, but they have a partnership with nonprofit organizations that then they work together. And so in this case, the Quincy mine and the hoist house is actually owned by a nonprofit, but that works with the federal government and the national park system. And this is one of the mines that you can actually tour.
So
They built a little funicular, and you can go down the side of the hill and then go into one of the shafts of the mine. What's that?
So this
No.
was just called Quincy Mine?
It was called the Quincy Mining Company. That was the name of the company itself. So this is the site that you can tour today. And this is what the hoist is actually the steam hoist that was the engine that powered the man car to go down and so the men could go to work. I've got a picture of that. And then the ore would be extracted and brought up. So there's just a stock certificate. This is the site, how it looked over 100 years ago. If you're ever to go up there today, it's all covered with trees. Unfortunately, many of these buildings are gone. This is Houghton over here. This is the town of Hancock here. And if you know anybody who's ever gone to Michigan Tech University, they probably live on this side. That's Houghton. And the university is just about a half a mile down this road.
So the mine was right across from Michigan Tech?
Yeah.
Oh.
And the reason why Michigan Tech is an important college for mining, it was actually initially a college of mining. And it was a very important college for mining. I think even today, if you're interested in mining, they have classes on that. It's an engineering college today, but it was a mining college at that time. And people from all over the world used to come to Michigan Tech to study there. The De Beers, do you ever hear of the De Beers? South African diamond mines. They actually sent some of their family over to study at Michigan Tech.
There's a ski lodge there now, isn't there?
The ski lodge is actually on this side.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's it's out of this picture, but just maybe a half a mile or a mile down to the left.
Oh.
Yeah, if you go to Michigan Tech, you can take downhill skiing as a sport.
Yeah, my son went there. That's why.
Oh, he did.
We
Oh,
were
cool.
there a couple of times.
Nice. So this is just one of, this site was very rich in copper ore. So there were actually many shafts that were near each other where they were extracting the copper along the top of this hill here. And this is just one of them. This is actually probably the most important. It's still the shaft house that survives. And it's Quincy number 2. Because there was different shaft house, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And this was number 2. At the turn of the 20th century, it was the deepest mine in the world. So, and that's what it looks like today. And this is the hoist house. So there used to be more of these, I think they're called trussels, that would have gone, staggered and get smaller all the way along. And then there was a metal cable that connected with the shaft house itself. And so this is the engine that powered that mine. So it would be on a continuous loop, the cable. And then they could hook up man cars to bring the men to and from work. They could hook up ore cars to bring the ore out of the mine. They could hook up watering cars to, what they would do is they would plunge these huge cars that were like railroad cars, about the size of, half the size of this room. And they would plunge them down into the mine when the lower levels started to fill up with water. And then they would extract the water that way. Which is very interesting because, of course, steam engines had been invented in the 18th century, early 18th century, to extract water out of mines. But this mine was so deep that apparently they couldn't do that. They must not have been able to get the right pressure going down so deep to extract the water. So by the early 20th century, they were able to this shaft house was important because they were actually able to mechanize the process of taking the big rock and making it into blow rock. So instead of having individual workers either crushing it initially with sledgehammers or then later with steam hammers, and now it was all processed. So the rock would just come up out of the mine, get dropped into this giant grinder, and then crushed, and then there'd be a rail car under here, an ore car under here, that would then take the crushed rock and copper bits, and it would go down the hill to be smelted. So, and this is a model. I went to a conference several years ago, and a graduate student built this model to give people an idea of exactly how that would look. So you would have these shafts that would be dug in, but then you would have these other shafts that would allow for the man cars and the ore cars to go down into the mine, and they'd be connected to those cables. And this is what the hoist itself looked like. So it has this enormous drum, and 100 years ago there would have been all iron cable that would have been wound around it. And the guy who operated it would have sat in the chair up here. And so it's on a continuous loop, so one going down and the other part coming up. So you always had one car moving down, one car moving up, and on these wheels would be the numbers, and that would be the number of the various levels going down and down and coming up. And there would be a bell so that whenever it would stop, there'd be bells that would ring down below. And he sat up here so as not to be distracted. So that was a really important job because people's lives were in his hands. So anyway, here's a picture showing the men ready to go down to work in the morning. And somewhere around 1910, from the looks of their mustaches. So anyway, with their lunch pails, it was common to have pasties, so because they would stay warm. You could actually what their wives would often do, if they were lucky, is that most of the pasty was filled with potatoes and meat, but the very end of it, if say it's this time of year, they might put apple and cinnamon or something on the end of it, so they could have they could have the meal and dessert. So the mine is just up the hill, just up the hill. This is actually Mount Ripley. That's actually where you can take your downhill skiing classes if you go to Michigan Tech. And then just out of sight is actually, this is like Quincy Hill, this whole area here, but that's where the shaft houses were and the hoist house. And then they would come down the hill here and on those rail cars, and then they would come into this smelting facility where they would process the copper and make it into copper ingots and copper cakes. And then ships would pull up alongside the docks here. It's all rotted out nowadays. You can just kind of see the remnants of the docks, and then send out the copper all over the world, manufacturers that wanted to buy it. Before this, this is the last surviving 19th century copper smelting facility in the United States. And so it's part of the national park. It's been restored, or it's been conserved, because when I was in graduate school, I went up in the 96, something like that, to take I think this photograph maybe from, oh yeah, this photograph was later, because when I was there in 96, all of these, anything that you see new metal, that had all rusted out and completely, roofs had completely collapsed. There were big iron beams, steel beams just kind of hanging in places. So it was a pretty crazy place, pretty dangerous place. It was actually open because there's all fencing that's built around it now, but it was not secured, so you could just wander in. And I walked through and took lots of photographs, but I didn't go in any of the buildings. I was terrified that one of those beams would let loose and I'd be crushed. But there were actually some students from Tech in there, like climbing around and stuff. I was like, you guys are nuts. So here's the docks where they're shipping out the copper ingots. So they make these massive copper ingots. And here's just a picture of the guys. This was the one-man drill that's introduced around 1913. And before that, there was a two-man drill. But the one-man drill was called the Widowmaker because the guys, in order to save costs, then they could have fewer workers, because they didn't have to work together. So they just have one guy working all day, 9 or 10-hour shifts, and could be very dangerous because if you're injured and you don't show up at the end of your shift, you might have been injured, 7, 8, 9 hours earlier, and you could be dead by that time. So they really didn't like working alone, you can imagine. But by 1913, it was getting more and more difficult already to extract the copper because they're going down so deep, and so costs are going up. So there was a massive copper strike. This was the Children's March in 1913, supporting their parents or their fathers. So the National Guard was sent out to keep order. And then just before Christmas 1913, there was a holiday party, a Christmas party being held for the children of the striking miners, mostly from the Finnish families, even though this is the Italian Hall. It was a group that was started by Italian immigrants. And my great-grandpa actually belonged to it. I have his membership book. And but it was being rented out to children of the Finnish miners. And someone from the company, the consensus is that they believe that there's one employee who worked for management who yelled fire to try to just kind of cause chaos during the strike. And it did. It led to a panic, and all these women and children thought there was a fire, and there was only one main way out, and they all headed down the staircase and started falling and tripping over each other. And so over 70 people are killed, and most of them are children. So it was a horrible, horrible tragedy, one of the worst tragedies in American history up until that point. And so it was in the papers all over the country. And this is a photograph just taken of the funeral. Sometimes there would be like many members of the same family who were all killed. So my mom has a friend whose aunt was at the party at that time. She's passed away, of course, now because she'd be over 100 years old. But luckily she had survived. And so here's an image of all the caskets. You can see that it's hard to tell, I think, maybe, but at least these here are all, it's not because they're snow covered, it's because they're white caskets, so that's showing that they're children. So anyway, I wanted you to be aware of that part of Michigan's industrial history during that time period, because it's probably the only time that has anybody ever heard of any of this before? Let's see. One. Oh, good. Because you went up there that one time, right? Oh, oh, really? I love going to Ontonagon. Do you go to Sills?
No, we haven't been up there in a while.
Oh.
Yeah, I went last month. We haven't gone for too long.
Okay. Sills is my favorite restaurant in Ontonagon.
Really?
Probably one of the few only restaurants in Utah. They make good pie. They make amazing pie. Like if you want strawberry pie in like June or the beginning of July, they actually go out and pick like strawberries. So they'll go into the woods in July and pick wild blueberries. So yeah, it's very good. Oh, okay. So anyway, so that's it for this first unit. What we're going to do is review for about the next half hour or so, and this is what I'd like to do before the test. So whenever we have a test, I like to have you guys play trivia. I think it's a fun way to review, and you can work together. It's a good way for you actually to get to know each other, because there's not a whole lot of opportunities in class where we can do that. So this is like the one time we can do that. And so what I'm going to do is break you into to groups, and you'll get some slips of paper. You're going to have to pick out a team name and turn in. Each team's going to just turn in one slip with the answer on it, hopefully the right answer, and then I'll keep track of the points. And the winning team will get 5 extra credit points. Okay, so that means you're going to have to try to stay quiet so that you don't tell the other team the answer, because you're going to be competing with each other. Okay? So let's try to figure this out. It's kind of a big class. Would you guys want online, like start moving up here and working with you? Because I have 5 and 6. That's the problem. Yeah. So here, that's how we're going to do. For sure, like you guys. Maybe you want to
Yeah, no, you want to come
your chair over. No, you go over there. 5, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Maybe you guys sort of maybe like kind of gather around some here, right here, or move these chairs and tables together, whatever you want to do. With you. I'm sure you 4. Okay? Yeah. 4, and you got 4 here. Or would we maybe want to have instead of 6 here, maybe 5 there? If someone wants to be 5. Oh, that'd be perfect. Thank you very much. That's great.
All right.
Whoever wants to fill it out.
How do you pay?
You know how this works. Did we do this? Which class were you in? Did we do it in the other classrooms? Yeah. We got 4 here. We got 5. So you got 15 names.
Yeah, me too. Maybe he's asking us questions and we have to write the answers down. And I think we have to write our names on one of these papers.
Yeah, you bring us the name down.
I want to go home.
Five teams.
No? Yeah. I'm gonna
Okay, question number 1. So everyone's got a team name. Make sure your team name is on your slip that you hand in. And generally, usually it's around 2 minutes. Sometimes if you need a little extra time, it can be 3 minutes, but it's around 2 to 3 minutes. I try to keep a timer just so that I can move on.
Oh, you skipped us.
Oh, you didn't get slips? Oh, I'm sorry. So here's the first question. Can you tell me who the exodusters were? Tell me who the exodusters were. Oh yeah, no notes, no books, no phones. Because what kind of competition is that? You have to use your brains. Use your brains. Tell me who the exodusters were. So put your phones away.
I only know the thing that is they had dust on them.
Remember, they were moving somewhere?
We got it.
You got it?
Yeah.
Okay, bring it up.
Oh, who's first? Who's first?
What is this? It's not a competition of
So
who
we
can
just put
get
our
to
name
me
on it,
first.
right?
Yeah.
Okay.
We just waited.
Put our name on it.
Your team name. Yeah.
Put the team name on every slip. What's our team name?
Yeah, whenever you turn anything into me, I need your team name. So team name, team.
With the boys.
Team name.
I was gonna say.
I went first. It was only 18.
It should be just what you do. Trying to watch out. It's up to the
I'm assuming you say 20,000 slaves that left the South.
Yes.
Oh, okay. Okay. So the exodusters were ex-slaves. I hope you said ex-slaves.
Yes, that's what I meant.
Okay.
Freeman.
Okay, the freedmen who left the South and went to Kansas to try to make a better life for themselves. So you got that one right. I thought that was going to be a hard one. Actually, I think that's one of I used that as a tiebreaker yesterday, and actually nobody got it. Question number 2. John B. Gordon and Nathan Bedford Forrest founded this veteran organization shortly after the Civil War, but it was radicalized. Tell me the name of that radical organization founded by John B. Gordon and Nathan Bedford Forrest. John B. Gordon and Nathan Bedford Forrest founded a veterans organization that was soon radicalized after the Civil War. Tell me the name of that veterans organization that was no longer a veterans organization. Well, sort of, at that time. They were a radical Southern group. No notes. You can keep a blank sheet of paper out, and if you want to write something down. Okay. If you want, that's another thing. If you want to keep a blank sheet of paper out and write things down that I'm asking you, that's cool. I'm not asking this for your health or my health. This is so that you can have ideas of what you should be studying.
Gordon and who?
Nathan Bedford Forrest.
What was the question?
Tell me the name of the Southern organization that was radicalized. It was a veterans organization. And then radicalized. This is really easy. This should be very easy. A bunch of white Southerners after the Civil War joining a group. What group? A bunch of white Southerners after the Civil War joining a group, ex-veterans, and then they're radicalized. Think of a radical Southern organization. You got about 1 more minute. There you go. Another reason to go back and look at the PowerPoints.
Something, I don't know.
This is the right group, but it's the same kind of
Okay,
organization.
very good. 20 seconds.
It makes sense. Yes.
Yeah, ours isn't right.
It is right.
Oh.
Have confidence in yourself. Alright. Okay, it's the Ku Klux Klan.
Dang.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There are other ones, but that one was founded by Nathan Bedford Forrest and John B. Gordon. But there's other ones, Knights of the White Camellia.
That's what I was thinking.
So,
The Knights of what? White Camellia.
White Camellia is one of them. So most Southerners could regain their citizenship back in the United States simply by taking an oath to the Union. What did planters and high officials in the Confederacy have to do during Reconstruction if they wanted their citizenship back? Something very specific. If you're a planter worth over $20,000, or you were an ex-Confederate officer or high official in the government, what did you have to do? Remember to keep it quiet. You're competing against each other.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, I'm just saying a question, sorry.
I tell you, it's a big help for me. Having all the questions and
All right, excellent. You had to personally ask President Johnson for a pardon. Was that? I'm not gonna. Was that something that President Lincoln wanted done, or President Johnson? President Johnson, right? That was not part of the 10% plan, but taking the oath, of course, was. Good.
Yeah.
Everyone was right.
Yeah.
Very good. Tell me who abolitionists were. Tell me who abolitionists were.
You have two.
Okay, they wanted slavery to be abolished. Great. Now, tell me which amendment to the Constitution abolished slavery. Tell me which amendment to the Constitution abolished slavery. And although I may not ask you today, I will certainly be asking you things about the 14th and 15th Amendments to the Constitution on your test. So keep that in mind.
I was so confident.
Oh, I think I just told you the answer.
What?
I'm so confused. I really need to say more.
Oh, no, I was like.
Yeah, right away. Yeah, what's the? Yeah, no, you said we need.
Oh, very good. You all got it. So it is the 13th Amendment to the Constitution.
A lot of this was in
Tell me how many acres could one claim under the Homestead Act? Tell me how many acres of land could one claim under the Homestead Act? Remember, you could get it for free.
It was the same thing. I believe it was the same thing for all of them.
Yeah.
The slave stopped at 16.
about you?
Are you?
Sure, a lot of money on the line.
Are you curious?
These guys are just Wall Street off there.
All right. Very impressive. You're all right again. 160 acres. Okay, here's one actually from the review, but it's going to show up. So, tell me the 3-day battle of the Civil War that was a turning point for the Union, in which the Union knew they were going to win. So tell me the name of the 3-day battle. Remember I talked about only a few battles, but the 3-day battle took place in 1863. It was the bloodiest battle of Civil War, but not the bloodiest single day. That was a different one.
Do you hear me?
Sorry, flip coin. Flip coin.
Hey.
I just flipped the coin.
Okay.
Yeah, he's here for the one.
Okay.
I'm broke. I don't have any money.
30 seconds.
If you want it, I'm curious. It's your job. It's your city. It's all on you. We only got 30 seconds.
Well, now you have 17 seconds.
That's enough.
That's the first battle. Oh, it's Gettysburg.
I flipped the coin. And we didn't listen to the coin.
Okay. So Gettysburg was the turning point. The Union saw that they could win in July 1st, 2nd, and 3rd, and win the battles. But no one realizes that the war is going to drag on for nearly another 2 years. But finally, after 2 years of mostly losing battles, the North knows that it can and will win. Remarkably, the South is able to hold out for almost another 2 years. Who were carpetbaggers? Tell me who were carpetbaggers. And remember, when I talked about that, there were 3 different groups. Remember, I said there's carpetbaggers, I said there's scallywags, I said there's redeemers. I'm asking about carpetbaggers. That doesn't mean that scallywags and redeemers isn't going to come up on the test as well. Okay.
Beggars when they took the tiles. The carpets from their stuff put them into a bag.
Full thunder, no thunder, no, right?
Well, I'm thinking of this. The worst mistake that my classes over the last 17 years have made in this course is that they don't take the vocabulary seriously and they don't study the vocabulary enough. It's a common mistake in the beginning of the semester and it happens all the time. So if you want to do well on this test, you're going to have to put the time in memorizing, something that people don't like to do. But I always find that by the time we get to October and November, people realize they need to do that. And I'm just saying it today because I've gone through this enough to know that people make the same mistake over and over. So you want to do well, know those vocabulary.
History makes sense.
Your essays are like. What's the details on how this went?
Okay, so they are Northerners that moved to the South and had a disproportionate amount of power in Southern society during the years of Reconstruction. So if you told me something along those lines, that they're Northerners that moved to the South, you got it right. Okay.
Hell yes.
Tell me the secret agreement that ended the constitutional crisis of the presidential election of 1876 and ended Reconstruction. So put Rutherford B. Hayes in the White House. But what's the name of that secret agreement in the following year? Remember there was a committee. So tell me the name of the agreement that gave Rutherford Hayes the presidency and ended Reconstruction. Remember, it also ends Reconstruction. So what's the name of that?
Does it look like I was 12 full credits behind. Started I did. I had you 12 times. Okay, those were my backup credits that I needed. I did.
I'm a mom.
Okay, 27 seconds. Okay, so it's actually, okay, so it's a compromise of 1877.
Oh my gosh.
Whoa.
I remember compromise.
You got a new study buddy.
All right, good. Let's see how this is going.
We might have gotten it. Yeah, we should hold it.
All right.
What we got?
So I'm going to ask one more question, and then, like I said, since we had a little bit of time today, if you want, you can take the last half hour of class then and work on your final project. Because most people don't even think about it. So you should at least look at the questions on Canvas. I would suggest that's something you could do today and start picking out questions to do your interviews. That should be an achievable goal. So, name, here's the last question. The last major incident between the United States military and the American Indians that occurred in December of 1890. What was the name of the last major incident between the United States military and the American Indians that occurred in December of 1890?
Because it's the only one I do.
Did you want the extra sheets of paper?
This occurred in
Isn't it the winner though?
They're gonna final essay do 13
well,
Oh, my mom's house. Massacre. I'll see you later. So I don't remember. Yeah. Either way, I just want to get my at least I ain't bought my money. I was 45.
it's actually not draining my battery. I've had the worst time with this battery.
So am I. Mine.
And mine's not, I put a new battery in
I don't even do anything.
last year.
It does.
Yeah, it's terrible.
You can replace the battery in these?
I didn't go to the Apple store. But I went when they had a discount because they had done something with the apps that was draining it. So there's like a 6-week period, I think, it was last, a year ago in January, that they allowed you to go. All right, 12 seconds. No? Nothing? Okay, so it's the Wounded Knee Massacre. All right. Any questions for me before we end? You're all. Oh.
Good luck with today's lesson.